So you've just finished the trials and your HSC is right around the corner. Here are a few techniques that I used to score a 99.3 atar graduating from North Sydney Boys in 2022. They're just three simple strategies that, if implemented correctly, can absolutely transform your ATAR. So if you've been cramming blindly or wasting hours on notes, this video is about to save you. Let's get right to it. Look, I get it. I was in your shoes as well, right? When I was studying in year 12, I was overwhelmed by the massive syllabi that I had to cover for roughly 6 subjects that I was doing. I was drowning in past papers and I was constantly second guessing if I was actually ready. The problem that I noticed in myself and the students that I tutor is that it isn't about the effort, it's more so the direction. Most students can study very hard but not very smart, and that's where these three frameworks come in to help you do so. Let's break it down step by step. So the first step has to do with preparation, and preparation comes with awareness of where your strengths and weaknesses are. Now, we don't want to be blindly studying or cramming past papers because we want the very limited amount of time that we have to be geared specifically to our weaknesses and building upon our strengths as well. That's why I recommend the first day of your HSC study to be geared towards preparation and preparation only. So then how do we prepare? I recommend the traffic light system. Yes, you may have heard about this before, but the goal isn't to use new fancy techniques, but to use tried and tested methods to our advantage to be as efficient as possible. For those of you that haven't heard what the traffic light system is or how we use it, we want to be making use of the NESA syllabus. All right, so here we've got the chemistry stage 6 syllabus. So what you can do is, if we scroll down, let me just go all the way down to where we can find some of the year 12 content. All right, so we are pretty much, okay, we've made it to module 5. What you can do is you can scroll down to where they go through the content and run through each of these questions and make sure you're very aware of all the dot points that they list here. So once you have your syllabi, make sure you go through it and implement the traffic light system by color coding each dot point either red, green, or yellow, depending on how proficient you feel with them. And it might sound tedious, but trust me, having that small bit of awareness of where your strengths and weaknesses lie can make a world of a difference when you actually approach studying for the HSC. The fact that you're more aware of where your content gaps lie gives you the power and control over deciding how your study goes and gives you that additional boost of confidence because you know that your study can now be more purposeful and specifically geared towards maximizing your ATAR. Now, a very quick warning is that students can very easily fall into the Dunning-Kruger trap. Now, like Google likes to define, the Dunning-Kruger trap is essentially where when you are under proficient in a subject, you overestimate your ability and your proficiency, and when you know too much, you sort of underestimate your ability. Now, most of the time, students fall into that middle of the curve. It sort of looks like a curve where when you don't know a lot of stuff, you know that you don't know a lot of stuff. And so you're more aware of your strengths and weaknesses. But when you're in that middle of the curve where you think you know a lot, but you actually don't, that's where most of the issue lies. So what we want to do is when we approach the syllabus and we color code everything, we want to be more overly cautious. If you ever feel like you slightly may not know a topic to its certainty, or you're unable to define where the certainty and where the upper limits of a topic lie, then mark it as yellow. And being overly cautious helps because it just means that you go back to study it more rigorously. And even if you end up realizing that you know everything, at least you didn't accidentally make a mistake there, right? Now, the reality is that you can't actually guarantee that you are completely safe from falling victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect. The only way to guarantee or to gauge if you have or have not fallen victim is to actually apply the content and looking back at your mistakes. Now, this is actually a good segue into my next tip, which is to spam past papers and, more importantly, use past papers along with a mistakes book. Both methods go hand in hand and complement one another, and you really want to make sure that you're using both at the same time. Now, advice like spamming past papers seems like a stock standard explanation, but if you give me a few minutes, I'll explain to you the mindset behind why spending hours on past papers is actually worth it when done correctly. To do this, we'll approach it from the POV of NESA and the HSC markers. Now, NESA as an examination board doesn't really care if you know the content. But actually, let me phrase that a little bit differently. They obviously care if you know the content, but there's only one way for them to tell if you know the content, and that is to gauge how well you can apply the content. There's a big difference between knowing the content and applying the content. And here's the cool thing. The HSC isn't as unique and scary as you think it is. There's a finite amount of content that they can test, which you can use to your advantage by using the traffic light system to gauge how aware you are of it. And within this finite system of content that they can test, there's only a finite amount of questions that they can ask. Within these questions, if you spam enough past papers like I did, you'll start to notice that all of these questions that you're tested on follow distinct patterns, and that every single question that you see is essentially a variation of a pattern of question that already exists out there. This is the exact reason why you need to be spamming past papers. Spamming past papers exposes you to all the different patterns of questions or types of questions that you can be tested on. And the neat thing is that every pattern of question or type of question only requires one method of solution. Now that's a crude simplification, but let me tell you a quick story of how I felt going into my HSC for chemistry. I had done roughly 30 to 40 past papers leading up into that chemistry HSC, for which I scored a 97 external. Now, sitting that actual HSC, what I realized was that every single question seemed easy to me. And the reason was because I had seen a variation of that question somewhere in one of the past papers that I'd done before. None of the questions were actually new per se. They were just using different data values and perhaps described a little bit differently. But because I had done all of these questions and I had looked back at all the marking criteria requirements, I felt like I knew what each question was asking me of, and I didn't feel like I was walking blind into that exam. I felt like I had already done a variant of that HSC exam, just merged between all the past papers that I had studied. If you're able to spam through enough past papers, you'll inherently be more aware of the different types of questions that you can be assessed on, and thus feel way more confident and capable going into the exam, as you'll start to recognize that most questions that you see or attempt are just variations of other questions that you've already attempted. But the thing is that spamming past papers only works if you learn from your mistakes. So this is where the mistakes book comes in. The goal here is to be as efficient as possible with our study time. We can only do that if we're actively aware of the mistakes that we're making and how to approach them. This is why I highly recommend setting up a mistakes book. So let's take a look at my physics mistakes book. The only thing that I regret about this is that I started it very, very late. As you can see, the date that I created this physics mistakes book was September 4th, 2022, meaning that it was in my final stretch going into the actual HSC. But you can see the way that I've structured it is that I've done it between module 5, 6, 7, and 8, and I would make sure that I constantly updated after every single past paper that I was doing. Now, I would recommend, after having taught students for the past 3 years, I noticed that you should probably be splitting up your mistakes book into silly mistakes and conceptual mistakes, and you can turn your conceptual mistakes and split them up further into the modules that I've done. But I think the way that I approached it here was I had general mistakes and I had module specific mistakes. So let's take a look at a few of them, right? The first one up here, when comparing orbital and escape velocity, compare the influence of gravity, because orbital velocity is still influenced by gravity, where gravity is a centripetal force, and in escape velocity is not present. So they might seem sort of disorderly, but it makes sense to me when I'm reading it at the time, because it's very geared to how I'm learning from that particular exam. And I guess these are quite simple assumptions, but I guess I would have mixed them up somewhere and got some of them wrong. But the issue here is to specifically identify where you're losing the marks in the actual past papers, right? A lot of students can get up to 2 to 3 marks out of a 4 to 5 mark question, but it's that goal of being able to get 4 out of 4, or at least 3 out of 4, that makes it very, very difficult. So you want to be looking at the marking criteria and seeing where that extra mark that you're losing is and why that is. And if you create a list of them, eventually when you read through this list, you'll start to gain a better understanding of where you're falling short. Now, like I said, your mistakes book doesn't have to be complicated. It could be super simple like mine was. Now, why does a mistakes book help? Because it keeps your mind on track of the common pitfalls that you fall into. So how do we make use of the mistakes book? Now, you might have noticed that going into your trials, when you're standing and waiting outside half an hour to 15 minutes before you actually walk into the exam hall, that you'll see a lot of people cramming last-minute notes. Looking back, I would personally highly recommend against this practice, because in my experience and in my students' experiences as well, we've all found that cramming short-term info can lead to you hyperfixating on that piece of information and then forgetting information that you had already learned before. So what ends up happening is that you actually do it to your detriment, and you end up losing the depth of info that you had known if you hadn't crammed that short-term piece of information or study cheat sheet right before going into the exam. Realistically as well, there's no way that you're going to be covering enough information in the adequate depth that close to the exam. So instead, I highly recommend that the last piece of information students consume before stepping foot in the exam to be their mistakes book. This means that the information at the forefront of your mind is essentially a summary or a replay of where you've made mistakes before in the past. This makes you more hyper aware of where you're prone to making mistakes and significantly reduces the potential for you to make silly mistakes and conceptual mistakes in your actual HSC. And the cool thing is that because the mistakes book inherently keeps track of your conceptual mistakes that you've made, they inherently linked a little bit into the content that you're studying and specifically to those common patterns and types of questions that you fall prey to. So it passively increases your awareness of the different types of questions that you can encounter for that particular subject as well. In my experience, the mistakes book has really helped me see progress and is probably the most valuable piece of studied habit that I developed going into the HSC. All right, so the next technique has to do with how we keep track of all the different subjects that we're studying for and how we manage the stress that comes along with it. It's tedious and it's very, very stressful, and I completely get it. So the technique that I'd recommend to all of my students is the manager-employee framework. It's a little bit of an analogy because it's not actually anything new, like I said at the beginning of the video. It's just slight mindset shifts and making use of proven study techniques that already exist. Now, I've already made a full video about it and its flexibility, so you can go check that out if you have time. But today we're going to compress my explanation and focus on it specifically for studying for the HSC. All right, so how do we actually make use of this manager-employee framework? So let's say that you're studying for 6 subjects, right? Let me just write those 6 subjects down. All right, these are the 6, technically 4 to 5, but 6 individual subjects that I did leading up into my HSC. The stressful part about studying for 6 different subjects is that even if I was studying for physics, for example, I'd constantly be stressing about like how I'm going to do in my common module and if I'm good enough in my short answer responses. So it's very difficult to stay streamlined and locked in on one subject because I'm constantly having to juggle and manage the stress of having to deal with 6 different subjects all at once. So the manager-employee framework is built around helping you to alleviate that stress and allowing you to streamline your focus, time, and energy at the task at hand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these subjects and I'm going to each assign them their own separate employee. And I'm going to label each of them. You don't really have to give them names, but I'll just label this M1, M2, E1, E2, C, and P. Just very simple analogies for what they are. You don't actually have to give them names. I'm just doing it for the sake of this video. Now, what I want you guys to do is whenever you're actually studying for a subject, I want you to assume the identity of that employee. The mindset for this comes from when I used to work in a minimum wage job, where essentially I would clock in for work and I would only focus on what's at hand, so either sales or back at the store. And then when I clock out for work, I couldn't care less about what I did during work, right? And it was so peaceful just only having to think about work when I clocked in for work and then doing whatever I wanted afterwards. So that's sort of the mental framework that we're going for and trying to replicate by tricking ourselves into thinking that we're, for example, the 3-unit employee or the English advanced employee or the chem employee, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to front load the stress. So we're going to front load the stress. And we're going to front load the stress onto the manager, right? Because what is the role of the manager? The role of the manager is to delegate the shifts and the tasks for the employees. So we've just identified who our employees are. So we're going to front load the stress onto the manager. And the manager's goal is to actually take on all of that stress of having to juggle 6 different subjects and how the progress was going for all the 6 different subjects and the dates for the HSCs and how we're going in terms of progressing for that, right? All of that stress is the role of the manager, and the manager is the one who has to take on all of that role. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the manager, who is another identity that we assume, clock in for maybe 5 minutes to around max an hour, I recommend. And we have this happen right before we go to sleep so we can keep a video log or like a voice memo log of how we're going with each of our subjects, and the manager can overview this and then plan the next day out, right? So all of that stress of having to manage the 6 different subjects is now compartmentalized and front loaded onto the manager, who only clocks in for 5 minutes to an hour during the day. And what we can do is when we start studying physics, for example, or 3-unit maths, I only clock in as the 3-unit maths or physics employee. So all I care about is doing physics. And it's easy for me to not care about English advanced, for example, while doing physics, because I know that the manager has divvied up tasks for English advanced for the English advanced employee, right? It's all of that analogy and metaphor that does the heavy lifting, right? I can work on physics with that peace of mind because the manager is the guy who has to worry about all that stress. So what it is essentially doing is it's creating mental barriers between each of the separate subjects. So when I'm studying chemistry, for example, I couldn't care less about how I'm going with Maths Advanced because I'm focused on the only task at hand as the chemistry employee, because that's what the role is assigned to me from the manager. The manager is the one who has to overview everything all together, but thankfully the manager only clocks in for like max an hour a day, right? So all of that stress we're front loading into that latter hour, and then we can take a chill pill and just focus on study for the rest of the day. Cool. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of what we've covered so far, right? So we've looked at the 3 frameworks that I recommend to boosting your ATAR, or more specifically, gearing your study specifically towards the HSC. So we want to use the traffic light system to identify where our strengths and weaknesses are and to begin our study so we know where to start off from. Then I would highly recommend spamming practice papers, but more importantly, spamming it with the mistakes book so we can take use of the fact that we're exposing ourselves to a wide variety of questions and then learning from them and actively learning from them as well by always updating our mistakes book and reading the mistakes book before you attempt even a past paper. And then in terms of managing our time, we can use the manager employee framework, which is really just an analogy. It's not like a whole new method, but it's that tricking yourself into just focusing and locking in on one particular subject. But the whole goal is that you don't need to overcomplicate things. They're just 3 very simple strategies that, if consistently applied, can literally make a huge difference and allow you to achieve your dream ATAR like it did for me. Now, if you found this helpful, please drop a comment down below on how you're going to use this framework. And if there are any other concepts that you'd like me to follow or any subject overviews that you'd like me to do, I know you guys are on your last leg towards the HSC. And yeah, I was, if I had known about this earlier, I would have been a lot better off for my HSC. So I hope this helps some of you guys with your study, and I'm keen to hear how your study is going as well. So yeah, if you guys want more study hacks or anything like that, just leave a comment down below and make sure to subscribe because we're only getting started.